September 19, 1940, a street corner in Warsaw's Żoliborz district. Rain-slicked cobblestones reflected the harsh glare of German searchlights as Wehrmacht soldiers herded Polish civilians into the backs of canvas-covered trucks, their breath visible in the autumn chill, their hands raised above their heads in surrender. Among the captured stood a 39-year-old man with sharp features and watchful eyes. Dressed in civilian clothes that were slightly too worn, his papers deliberately left at home. Witold Pilecki, a former Polish cavalry officer who had never received intelligence training, never learned espionage tradecraft, and never operated undercover before this moment, had just done something military historians would later describe as unprecedented in the annals of warfare. He had deliberately walked into a Nazi street roundup to get himself arrested and sent to a concentration camp. The Germans called these operations łapanka, catching action, random seizures of Polish civilians for forced labor or imprisonment. The destination for tonight's captured, a camp in southern Poland that prisoners called simply by its German name. Auschwitz. The survival rate, according to the limited intelligence the Polish underground possessed, approached zero. The camp had opened just 5 months earlier. Of the first transport of 728 Polish political prisoners, fewer than 200 remained alive. The mathematics were brutal. 6 months inside meant death. The Germans themselves made no secret of it. Camp Commandant Rudolf Höss told new arrivals they had 3 months to live. Maybe 6 if they were lucky. No one escaped. No one survived long enough to report what happened inside. Pilecki knew these numbers when he volunteered for the mission. His commanders in the Polish underground, including General Stefan Rowecki, the leader of the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, had called his proposal certain suicide. Major General Tadeusz Komorowski stated it plainly. Infiltrating Auschwitz is not an intelligence operation. It is a death sentence with a preliminary intelligence gathering phase. The British Special Operations Executive, reviewing the proposal in their London headquarters, filed it under suicide missions we cannot authorize. The consensus among professional intelligence officers across 3 countries was unanimous. No human being could voluntarily enter Auschwitz, survive long enough to gather meaningful intelligence, build a resistance network, and escape to tell the tale. What they didn't know was that Pilecki had spent his entire adult life preparing for impossible missions, that he understood something fundamental about human survival under extreme conditions that the professional spies had missed, and that within 48 hours of his arrest, he would begin building an intelligence network inside Auschwitz that would eventually encompass nearly 1,000 men, send detailed reports to the Allied command, and provide the first comprehensive eyewitness testimony of what would become the Holocaust's most infamous killing center. Testimony that would be disbelieved, dismissed, and buried by the very people who needed it most, until it was far too late. The stakes that night extended far beyond one man's survival. In September 1940, occupied Poland had become a laboratory for Nazi racial policy. The German administration divided the conquered territory into zones. The general government under Hans Frank, and territories directly annexed into the Reich. Frank announced his governing philosophy in December 1939. Poland shall be treated like a colony. The Poles will become the slaves of the greater German world empire. The implementation of this policy required suppression of Polish culture, liquidation of the intelligentsia, and the creation of a vast system of forced labor and concentration camps. Auschwitz, originally intended as a detention center for Polish political prisoners, was expanding. The Germans had already begun preliminary surveys of the adjacent village of Brzezinka, which they renamed Birkenau, for a massive expansion. Intelligence from sources inside the German administration suggested something unprecedented was planned, but details remained fragmentary. Polish intelligence needed someone inside. They needed eyes on the ground. They needed the impossible. The underground had tried 3 times before to infiltrate the camp system. In June 1940, they attempted to insert an agent into a labor transport bound for Mauthausen. He died during the rail journey, crushed when prisoners were packed too tightly into cattle cars and suffocated. In July, they bribed a German guard to carry intelligence out of Sachsenhausen. The guard took the money and reported the contact to the Gestapo. 17 members of the underground cell were arrested and executed. In August, they tried to recruit a Polish collaborator working as a capo, a prisoner functionary, inside Auschwitz. The man agreed, took an advance payment, and disappeared. No intelligence emerged, no contact was re-established. The professional intelligence officers concluded that camps like Auschwitz were intelligence black holes. Information went in, nothing came out. The system was designed to prevent exactly what the underground needed: observation, documentation, and testimony. The human cost made the mission even more urgent. By September 1940, the Nazi occupation had killed approximately 65,000 Polish civilians in summary executions, mass shootings, and camp deaths. The number climbed daily. Catholic priests, university professors, politicians, military officers, and intellectuals, anyone who might lead resistance, were systematically murdered. The AB Action, or Extraordinary Pacification Action, specifically targeted the educated classes. German police and SS units worked from prepared lists of names, conducting mass arrests followed by mass executions. In the Palmari forest outside Warsaw, the Germans murdered roughly 1,700 people between December 1939 and July 1940, shooting them in groups of 20 and dumping bodies into mass graves. The evidence suggested the occupiers intended to decapitate Polish society entirely, eliminating anyone capable of organizing resistance. The underground needed intelligence on the scale of the killing, the locations of mass graves, the identities of perpetrators, and most critically, what was happening inside the camps where thousands were disappearing without trace. Colonel Stefan Rowecki, commander of the Union of Armed Struggle, which would become the Armia Krajowa in February 1942, faced an impossible choice. Every day, without intelligence from inside the camps meant more people disappeared into a void. Every failed infiltration attempt meant blown networks, executed agents, and no progress. The professional intelligence officers were right. Sending someone into Auschwitz was suicide. It was also necessary. The timeline imposed its own pressure. Reports from Germany indicated the war might last years. The occupation of Poland might be permanent. Every month that passed allowed the Germans to consolidate control, eliminate resistance, and perfect their system of terror. Intelligence collected now might prove decisive later. Intelligence collected next year might come too late. The underground needed someone willing to die gathering information that might never be acted upon, building networks that might never be activated, and sending reports that might never be believed. Witold Pilecki understood all of this when he walked into his commander's office in August 1940 and proposed the mission himself. He was the wrong man for the job in every conventional sense. Born May 13, 1901, in Olonets, Russia, his family living in temporary exile from Polish territories. He had never worked in intelligence, never operated undercover, and never received formal training in espionage tradecraft. His background was military and agricultural. He fought in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1920, served in the cavalry, and then returned to civilian life to manage his family estate in Sukurce. He married, had 2 children, and spent his 30s as a gentleman farmer who taught horsemanship and helped organize community defense. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Pilecki immediately joined the fight, commanding a cavalry unit that engaged German forces during the initial campaign. After Poland's defeat, he helped establish one of the first resistance organizations, the Secret Polish Army, which merged into larger underground structures. By mid-1940, he was working in Warsaw, coordinating intelligence operations and living under a false identity. His proposal emerged from years of observation, not espionage training. He had watched the German occupation methods evolve. He noticed the systematic targeting of military officers, men like himself, in the roundups. He understood that his background made him exactly the type of prisoner the Germans wanted in Auschwitz. A former officer, politically active, and prominent enough to be worth breaking, but not so prominent that his arrest would trigger international attention. He could blend into the target population perfectly, because he was the target population. The insight was simple. Instead of sending an agent pretending to be a political prisoner, send an actual political prisoner who happened to be an agent. The Germans would do the infiltration work themselves. What convinced him this insane plan might succeed was something he'd learned from his years in cavalry combat and from managing agricultural workers through economic depression. Survival under extreme conditions wasn't primarily about physical strength or technical skill. It was about will, about maintaining human connection under dehumanizing conditions, and about finding purpose even when hope seemed absent. Professional spies trained in tradecraft didn't have the kind of experience that mattered inside a concentration camp. Combat veterans who had watched friends die and kept fighting did. Men who had survived economic catastrophe and kept their communities together did. Pilecki believed, against all professional military judgment, that he could enter Auschwitz, survive long enough to understand it, and build an organization from the inside not through spy tradecraft, but through something more fundamental, by treating other prisoners as human beings worth organizing, worth saving, and worth dying for. His commanders approved the mission in late August with the explicit understanding that it was likely suicide. No extraction plan existed. No rescue would be attempted. He would be alone, and if he failed, when he failed, in the estimation of professional intelligence officers, the underground would write him off as another casualty of the occupation. They gave him a false identity, Tomasz Serafiński, resident of Warsaw, and a cover story that would hold up under initial interrogation. They gave him contacts for communication once inside, if survival proved possible. They gave him approximately 4 weeks to prepare. Then they instructed him to get himself arrested. On the night of September 19, 1940, Pilecki deliberately positioned himself in a neighborhood known for German roundups. He carried identity papers in the name Tomasz Serafiński. He wore civilian clothes without military bearing. He waited for the trucks. When the Wehrmacht soldiers began forcing civilians into the vehicles at gunpoint, Pilecki moved toward them rather than away. He made eye contact. He moved slowly enough to be caught. He raised his hands at the first command. Within minutes, he was in the back of a truck with approximately 60 other captured Poles, being driven to a temporary holding facility, beginning a journey that would take him to Auschwitz and would last 947 days, 2 years, 7 months, and 1 week, inside a place where the average survival time was measured in months. What happened in those first hours after arrest would determine everything that followed. The Germans transported the captured civilians to the Pilecki prison in Warsaw for preliminary processing. The SS interrogators were brutal and efficient. They beat prisoners to establish control, checked identities against wanted lists, and sorted people into categories: immediate execution, forced labor, or concentration camp. Pilecki's false identity held. His cover story, that he was a civilian artist and reserve officer caught in the roundup, fit the profile of prisoners being sent to Auschwitz. The interrogators saw nothing unusual about Tomasz Serafiński. He was processed with the standard brutality, stripped, beaten, and given a prisoner number. They shaved his head. They took his clothes. They dressed him in striped prison garments. They loaded him into a cattle car with approximately 2,000 other prisoners from multiple roundups, packed them so tightly that standing room was scarce, and sealed the doors. On September 21, 1940, the transport departed Warsaw. The journey to Auschwitz took approximately 24 hours. Men died in the cattle cars from suffocation, dehydration, and beatings from guards who periodically opened the doors to count prisoners and remove corpses. When the train arrived at the Auschwitz station on September 22, approximately 1,700 prisoners emerged. The rest were already dead. The arrival procedure at Auschwitz was designed to destroy identity and establish absolute submission. SS guards forced prisoners off the trains with clubs and dogs. They beat anyone who moved too slowly. They shot anyone who resisted. They lined prisoners in rows and counted them repeatedly, beating prisoners for any perceived disorder in the ranks. Camp Commandant Rudolf Höss personally addressed the new arrivals. His speech, recorded in multiple survivor testimonies, was explicit. "You came here not to a sanatorium, but to a German concentration camp, from which the only way out leads through the chimney of the crematorium. If anyone does not like this, he is invited to throw himself against the electrified wire. If there are any Jews in this transport, they have the right to live no longer than 2 weeks. Priests have 1 month, the rest 3 months. The speech wasn't psychological warfare. It was accurate statistical prediction based on existing mortality rates. Pilecki received prisoner number 4859. The number was tattooed on his left forearm, a procedure introduced just weeks earlier. He was assigned to a barracks in the main camp, designated for Polish political prisoners. The initial days inside Auschwitz confronted him with a reality worse than intelligence reports had suggested. The camp contained approximately 7,000 prisoners in September 1940, mostly Poles arrested in the German pacification campaign. Daily mortality ran between 30 and 50 men. Prisoners died from beatings, shootings, exhaustion, starvation, and disease. The SS guards killed prisoners arbitrarily, for moving too slowly, for looking at guards, for being in the wrong place, or for no reason at all. The work assignments were designed to break prisoners physically, hauling stones, digging drainage ditches, constructing new camp buildings, all while running under the clubs of kapos. Food rations provided roughly 700 calories per day for prisoners doing 12 hours of heavy manual labor. The mathematics guaranteed death. The body consumed itself, muscle wasted. Disease spread in the overcrowded, unsanitary barracks. Men who arrived strong were skeletons within weeks. The Nazi system had created something unprecedented, a machine for destroying human beings slowly enough to extract maximum labor value before death. Every element of camp life served this purpose. The brutality wasn't random sadism, though sadism was present. It was systematic dehumanization with clear objectives. The morning roll call forced prisoners to stand at attention for hours, regardless of weather, while guards counted and recounted. Any perceived irregularity triggered beatings. Prisoners who collapsed were beaten until they stood, or until they died. The work details operated on the principle that prisoner life had no value. If someone died hauling stones, another prisoner would take his place. The SS maintained a constant supply of new prisoners through regular transports from occupied territories. The camp didn't need to keep prisoners alive. It needed to work them to death while maintaining the appearance of labor discipline. Against this systematic destruction, Pilecki began organizing. His first contacts were careful and slow. He identified other prisoners who showed signs of resistance rather than submission. Men who still tried to help others, who shared food when they had none, who maintained dignity under conditions designed to eliminate dignity. His initial recruits included men he had known before the war. Major Jan Wojtkiewicz, who commanded the cavalry unit where Pilecki served, and Stanisław Dering, a physician who was maintaining a secret medical practice inside the camp hospital. These initial contacts formed the core of what would become Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, the Union of Military Organization, known by its Polish acronym ZOW. The organization's purpose was threefold: gather intelligence about camp operations and German plans, maintain morale and mutual aid among prisoners to improve survival rates, and prepare for possible armed uprising or mass escape if the military situation outside created an opportunity. The challenges of organizing inside Auschwitz made conventional resistance impossible. The SS maintained constant surveillance through Karpos, prisoner functionaries who received better food and treatment in exchange for informing on other prisoners and maintaining brutal discipline. Any conversation between prisoners could be reported. Any sharing of food could be punished with death. Any sign of organization triggered immediate execution of everyone involved. The camp administration applied collective punishment. If one prisoner escaped, the SS shot 10 prisoners from his barracks. If one prisoner was caught with contraband, everyone in his work detail was beaten. The system incentivized prisoners to inform on each other, to isolate themselves, and to focus entirely on individual survival rather than collective resistance. Building an organization under these conditions required methods that professional intelligence officers had never imagined, because they had never operated in conditions where every human interaction was potentially fatal. Pilecki's approach drew on his experience from community organizing and military command. He didn't recruit members by approaching them directly. Instead, he identified natural leaders, prisoners who others already trusted, and brought them into his confidence slowly, over weeks of careful observation. He used the cover of work details to have whispered conversations during moments when guards weren't watching. He developed a system of coded communication using seemingly innocent phrases that carried double meanings. "How is your family?" meant, "Have you made contact with your cell?" "I hope for better weather" meant, "Expect a message soon." The organization grew cell by cell, each member knowing only a few others, insulating the network against infiltration. By December 1940, approximately 3 months after Pilecki's arrival, ZOW had recruited roughly 100 members across multiple barracks and work details. The intelligence gathering began immediately. Pilecki observed everything: the structure of SS command, the names and personalities of guards, the daily routines of camp administration, the mortality rates in different work details, the locations of warehouses and armories, and crucially, the signs of camp expansion. In October 1940, the SS began surveying land in Brzezinka, Birkenau, for a massive expansion project. Camp administrators talked openly about plans for tens of thousands of additional prisoners. Construction materials arrived daily. German civilian contractors came to the camp for planning meetings. Pilecki documented all of it, memorizing details he couldn't write down, and began preparing his first report for the underground. The problem was getting information out. Mail from prisoners was heavily censored and limited to carefully controlled postcards with pre-printed messages. Direct smuggling of written documents was nearly impossible. Guards randomly searched prisoners, and any caught with written notes was tortured to death along with everyone in his barracks. Pilecki needed a method that was both secure and repeatable. His solution used the camp's own corruption against it. SS guards, despite their ideological commitment to Nazi racial theory, were susceptible to bribery. Camp administrators stole prisoner property. Systematically, civilian workers who came to the camp for construction projects could be bribed or recruited. Pilecki identified a civilian worker named Helena Stupnica, who transported laundry between the camp and nearby towns. She agreed, at significant risk to her own life, to carry messages sewn into clothing. The first report reached the underground in Warsaw in November 1940, approximately 2 months after Pilecki's arrest. The report detailed conditions inside Auschwitz with precision that shocked even hardened resistance commanders. Pilecki documented the daily mortality rate, the systematic brutality of camp administration, the names of the worst SS guards, the camp's organizational structure, and the plans for expansion. He included information about individual prisoners and requested that the underground inform their families. He described the arrival of transports and the selection process. He reported that the camp was not primarily a labor facility, but a killing center disguised as a prison. The intelligence was comprehensive, specific, and actionable. It was also almost completely disbelieved. Colonel Stefan Rowecki, commander of the Armia Krajowa, accepted that Pilecki had survived and was sending intelligence. That much was undeniable. But the content of the report seemed exaggerated. A concentration camp where hundreds died monthly from systematic brutality. A German administration explicitly planning to expand the facility to hold hundreds of thousands. SS guards who killed prisoners for entertainment and called it discipline. The reports read like atrocity propaganda, not sober intelligence assessment. Rowecki forwarded them to the Polish government in exile in London with a note. Source is reliable, but may be reporting rumors rather than direct observation. Recommend verification before action. The Polish government in exile, operating from London under Prime Minister Władysław Sikorski, forwarded Pilecki's reports to British intelligence. The British response was skeptical, bordering on dismissive. Major Frank Foley, operating from the Secret Intelligence Service MI6 office, reviewed the reports in early 1941 and wrote, "The described conditions, while certainly harsh, appear exaggerated beyond credibility. Mortality rates of this scale would be unprecedented even under wartime conditions. Recommend treating as unverified prisoner testimony, useful for propaganda but questionable for operational intelligence." The British had reasons for skepticism. Intelligence from Germany throughout 1940 had proven unreliable. Resistance groups, eager to secure Allied support, sometimes exaggerated enemy atrocities. The British intelligence establishment, trained in European power politics and conventional warfare, lacked any framework for understanding what the Nazis were actually doing. A systematic program to work political prisoners to death on an industrial scale as a matter of state policy was outside their experience. It seemed more likely that Pilecki was reporting rumors than that the Germans were implementing something entirely unprecedented. The skepticism extended beyond British intelligence. Jan Karski, another famous Polish resistance courier, delivered his own eyewitness testimony about Nazi atrocities to British and American officials in 1942-1943, including detailed accounts of the Warsaw Ghetto and a transit camp. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, after hearing Karski's testimony, said, "I did not say that he was lying. I said that I cannot believe him. There is a difference." This statement captured the fundamental problem. Even people who trusted the messenger found the message impossible to accept. The human mind, confronted with systematic atrocity on an unprecedented scale, defaulted to skepticism rather than acceptance. It was psychologically easier to doubt the witness than to accept the reality. Pilecki continued sending reports throughout 1941 and into 1942. Each report provided more detail. The arrival of Soviet prisoners of war and their mass execution, the construction of Birkenau, the installation of gas chambers disguised as shower facilities, the arrival of Jewish transports, and their immediate selection for death, the expansion of the camp system to include subcamps throughout Silesia. The intelligence accumulated became more specific and, paradoxically, became less believable. By mid-1942, Pilecki was reporting that Auschwitz had killed hundreds of thousands of people, that the camp had become the center of a systematic program to murder the Jewish population of occupied Europe, and that the expansion continued with German plans to increase killing capacity even further. Inside the camp, ZOW had grown into a sophisticated organization. By 1942, membership exceeded 500 prisoners across the main camp and the expanding Birkenau facility. The organization maintained an intelligence network, a mutual aid system that redistributed food and medicine to the weakest prisoners, a communications system with the underground outside, and preliminary plans for an armed uprising. Pilecki believed that if the Polish underground or Soviet forces launched an offensive near Auschwitz, ZOW could seize control of the camp from within, overpowering guards and allowing mass escape. The plan required external military support. The prisoners inside, weakened by starvation and lacking weapons, couldn't break out alone. But if paratroopers dropped outside the camp, or if partisan units attacked simultaneously, ZOW could coordinate from inside. The organization prepared for this possibility, identifying weapons storage locations, mapping guard positions, and training members in basic military tactics during work details. The armed uprising never came. The underground, aware of ZOW's existence and capabilities, couldn't commit forces to an assault on Auschwitz. The military situation in occupied Poland made offensive operations nearly impossible. The German occupation was overwhelming. The resistance lacked heavy weapons, air support, or artillery. Assaulting a fortified SS installation with thousands of guards seemed suicidal. The underground needed to preserve its forces for a future general uprising when the military balance shifted. Pilecki's requests for external support were acknowledged but never approved. Colonel Rowecki's response in late 1942 was polite but final. Your organization has achieved remarkable success. Continue intelligence gathering and prisoner support. Armed uprising is not feasible at this time. We will inform you if circumstances change. Circumstances never change sufficiently. By early 1943, Pilecki concluded that no external support would come, that his reports were being filed rather than acted upon, and that the mass murder at Auschwitz would continue regardless of how much intelligence he provided. The realization was crushing. He had spent 947 days inside Auschwitz building an organization, sending detailed reports, documenting genocide, and preparing for a rescue that would never arrive. Thousands of prisoners had died around him. Hundreds of thousands had been murdered in the gas chambers. The Allies knew his reports had reached London, had been forwarded to Washington, but knowledge without action meant nothing. The bureaucratic inertia, the institutional skepticism, the strategic calculations that prioritized other objectives, all combined to ensure that Auschwitz would continue operating until the Germans themselves abandoned it. Pilecki made a decision that military historians still debate. He would escape, return to Warsaw, and deliver his testimony in person. If the problem was that his written reports lacked credibility, perhaps direct testimony would force action. If institutional skepticism prevented proper assessment of the intelligence, perhaps a face-to-face briefing would overcome it. The decision to escape was nearly as dangerous as the original infiltration. Escape attempts from Auschwitz were rare and almost always failed. The SS maintained overlapping security. Guard towers, searchlights, electrified fences, regular patrols, and the threat of collective punishment. Prisoners who escaped triggered immediate lockdown, intensive search operations, and the execution of 10 prisoners from their barracks. The handful of successful escapes had been opportunistic, not planned, and the escapees had often died shortly afterward from exhaustion, capture, or execution. Before we continue with the escape that would risk everything Pilecki had accomplished, I need to ask you something important. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of World War II's most extraordinary acts of courage, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel exists to bring you the untold stories of people who did the impossible when the world needed it most. Your support helps us keep researching and producing these detailed historical narratives. Now, let's see what happened when Pilecki decided to break out of the place no one was supposed to leave alive. April 26, 1943. The night bakery detail. Auschwitz maintained a large bakery outside the main camp fence that supplied bread for guards and prisoners. The bakery operated 24 hours, and prisoners on night shifts could move between buildings with less intensive supervision than during daylight hours. Pilecki had arranged a transfer to the bakery detail specifically for escape planning. For 2 months, he and 2 other prisoners, Jan Redze and Edward Ciesielski, studied the routine, identified the blind spots in guard coverage, and prepared. They stole civilian clothing. They accumulated bread and documents. They identified an escape route through a drainage system that led outside the immediate security perimeter. On the night of April 26, around 2 a.m., when the guard rotation created a brief gap in surveillance, they cut through a warehouse door, crawled through a drainage pipe, and emerged outside the main fence line. The next 6 hours were the most dangerous of Pilecki's life. German protocols for escape were brutal and immediate. Sirens, searchlights, dogs, patrols, and notifications to all surrounding SS and police units. The escapees needed to cover approximately 60 kilometers to reach relative safety in German-occupied territory where underground contacts could hide them. They had no vehicle, limited food, and were wearing stolen civilian clothes that would draw attention if seen up close. They walked through fields, avoided roads, and hid during daylight. German patrols searched aggressively for 2 days. The SS interrogated prisoners in the bakery detail. They shot 10 prisoners in collective punishment, standard protocol. But the manhunt failed to locate the escapees. On April 28, after nearly 48 hours of continuous movement, Pilecki and his companions reached a safe house operated by the underground near the town of Bochnia. They were free. After 947 days inside Auschwitz, Witold Pilecki had escaped from the camp's impossible grip. His immediate priority was reporting to underground command. He needed to deliver testimony in person, to explain that the written reports, however detailed, didn't capture the full horror of what was happening, and to demand action before more hundreds of thousands died. He spent several weeks in hiding while the underground verified his identity and arranged safe passage to Warsaw. The verification process itself revealed something disturbing. The underground's own intelligence officers were skeptical that prisoner 4859 was actually Witold Pilecki. The man who returned from Auschwitz was 40 pounds lighter than the officer who had entered, scarred from beatings and psychologically marked by nearly 3 years of witnessing mass murder. Some intelligence officers suspected he might be a German plant, an imposter sent to infiltrate the underground. Only when multiple sources confirmed his identity and when witnesses recognized him despite his physical transformation did the underground accept his return. In August 1943, Pilecki arrived in Warsaw and delivered his verbal debriefing to Armia Krajowa intelligence officers. The debriefing lasted several days. He described the camp's structure, the daily routines, the methods of murder, the scale of killing operations, and the expansion of Birkenau into the largest killing center in human history. He explained that his written reports, while accurate, couldn't convey the systematic nature of the genocide, the industrial efficiency of the murder process, or the clear German intention to kill every Jewish person they could capture. He provided names of SS officers, details of camp administration, and specific technical information about the gas chambers and crematoriums. He requested immediate action, bombing of the camp, dropping weapons for uprising, or military rescue operation. The intelligence officers listened carefully, took detailed notes, and thanked him for his service. Then they informed him that military action remained impossible. The strategic situation hadn't changed. The Armia Krajowa needed to preserve its forces. An assault on Auschwitz was not feasible. Pilecki was ordered to write a comprehensive report of his experiences. Over the next several months, while participating in other underground operations, he produced a document known later as the Witold Report, a detailed account of Auschwitz from September 1940 to April 1943, including organizational structure, prisoner treatment, killing methods, and resistance activities. The report was approximately 40,000 words and included specific recommendations for Allied action. It was translated, forwarded to London, and distributed to British and American intelligence agencies. The response was the same skepticism that had greeted his earlier reports, now compounded by the broader problem of Holocaust testimony. By late 1943, multiple sources were reporting systematic mass murder of European Jews. The reports came from resistance movements, escaped prisoners, neutral observers, and German defectors. The Allies had sufficient evidence to know that genocide was occurring. The problem wasn't lack of information. The problem was lack of will to act on the information. Military priorities focused on winning the war through conventional campaigns. Specific operations to stop the Holocaust, like bombing Auschwitz, were evaluated through military cost-benefit analysis and consistently rejected. The bureaucratic battle over bombing Auschwitz exemplified the institutional failure to act on intelligence. The proposal to bomb the camp emerged from multiple sources throughout 1943 and 1944. The Jewish Agency, receiving reports from resistance movements, formally requested that the Allies bomb the gas chambers and crematoriums, or bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz. The World Jewish Congress submitted similar requests. Pilecki's reports provided detailed maps and targeting information. The U.S. War Department evaluated the request in June 1944. John J. McCloy, Assistant Secretary of War, responded, "The War Department is of the opinion that the suggested air operation is impracticable. It could be executed only by the diversion of considerable air support, essential to the success of our forces now engaged in decisive operations, and would in any case be of such doubtful efficacy that it would not amount to a practical project." The British Air Ministry reached similar conclusions. The official rationale was that bombing would divert resources from military operations, that precision strikes against specific camp buildings were technically difficult, and that bombing might kill prisoners along with guards. The declassified documents reveal a more complex reality. Allied aircraft were flying over Auschwitz regularly by mid-1944. On August 20, 1944, U.S. bombers attacked the IG Farben industrial facility at Monowitz, approximately 5 miles from the main Auschwitz camp. The bombers had the capability, the range, and the aerial reconnaissance photographs. The technical argument against bombing was weaker than officials admitted. The real reason for inaction was strategic priority combined with institutional anti-Semitism and simple indifference. The military command didn't prioritize stopping the Holocaust. Intelligence about mass murder, however detailed and verified, didn't translate into operational orders because the institutional structure didn't value Jewish lives sufficiently to divert any resources from conventional military objectives. Pilecki's intelligence, like Karski's testimony and countless other reports, was filed, acknowledged, and ignored. The tactical impact of Pilecki's intelligence work went beyond what the Allies failed to do. Inside Auschwitz, ZOW continued operating after his escape. The organization maintained its mutual aid network, continued intelligence gathering, and supported prisoner survival. Survivors' testimonies credit ZOW with saving hundreds of lives through food redistribution, protection from particularly brutal capos, and medical care provided secretly by doctors in the organization. The resistance engaged in sabotage. slowing work details, deliberately misunderstanding German orders, and occasionally destroying equipment or materials. The psychological impact was perhaps most significant. Prisoners who knew about ZOW, even if they weren't members, understood that organization and resistance were possible, that complete submission wasn't inevitable, and that maintaining human dignity under dehumanizing conditions was a choice. The existence of resistance, however limited its practical impact, meant that prisoners had agency rather than being purely victims. The operational campaign value of Pilecki's intelligence became clearer after the war. His reports provided the most comprehensive documentation of Auschwitz's evolution from a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners into the Holocaust's primary killing center. Historians and prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials used his testimony and reports to establish the timeline of genocide, the methods of murder, and the bureaucratic structure that implemented it. The detailed observations about SS officers, their specific actions, and the chain of command helped establish individual culpability. The evidence Pilecki gathered while risking his life every day for 947 days became foundational documentation for understanding how the Holocaust was implemented systematically, rather than through random atrocity. The strategic war-level impact remains contested. Some historians argue that if the Allies had acted on Pilecki's intelligence and bombed Auschwitz in 1943 or 1944, hundreds of thousands of lives might have been saved. Others argue that bombing would have been militarily ineffective and that the only way to stop the Holocaust was to win the war faster, which required keeping all resources focused on conventional military campaigns. What's undeniable is that Pilecki succeeded in his impossible mission. He infiltrated Auschwitz, survived, organized resistance, gathered comprehensive intelligence, and escaped, only to discover that the truly impossible part wasn't surviving the camp, but convincing people to believe and act on what he reported. The question of recognition haunted the remainder of Pilecki's life. After escaping Auschwitz and reporting to Warsaw, he continued working for the underground. When the Warsaw Uprising erupted in August 1944, Pilecki fought as a commander in the Śródmieście district. He commanded a company of resistance fighters during 63 days of brutal urban combat against German forces. The uprising failed. The Germans crushed the resistance systematically, killing approximately 200,000 civilians and destroying 85% of Warsaw's buildings. Pilecki was captured and spent the remainder of the war in German POW camps, first Murnau and then Oflag 7A. He was liberated by American forces in April 1945. After liberation, Pilecki faced another impossible choice. Communist forces controlled Poland. The Soviet-backed provisional government was systematically eliminating members of the non-communist resistance, arresting Armia Krajowa veterans, and consolidating totalitarian control. The Polish government in exile in London, which Pilecki had served, was not recognized by the Western Allies. Many resistance veterans fled to the West and lived in exile. Pilecki chose to return to Poland. He believed, despite warnings from fellow veterans, that he could continue intelligence work against the communist regime, that his testimony about Auschwitz would provide moral authority, and that Poland needed people willing to resist Soviet domination, just as they had resisted German occupation. It was a fatal miscalculation. The communist security services, the Bezpieczeństwa, had orders to eliminate the non-communist resistance. Pilecki's record made him a priority target. In 1947, the security services arrested him on charges of espionage and plotting against the state. The trial was a show trial, the outcome predetermined, the evidence fabricated or twisted. Prosecutors used his service to the London government in exile as proof of treason. They accused him of being a Western spy. They presented his resistance work as terrorism. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed by a single shot to the back of the head in Mokotów prison in Warsaw. He was 46 years old. His body was dumped in a mass grave. His family was forbidden to mourn publicly. His name was erased from Polish history. The communist regime classified all records of his service, suppressed testimony about his work in Auschwitz, and presented him as a traitor rather than a hero. For 41 years, the truth about Witold Pilecki remained classified and suppressed. The Polish communist government maintained the fiction that he had been an enemy of the state justly executed. Survivors of Auschwitz who knew about ZOW were intimidated into silence. The reports he had risked everything to send were locked in archives. Western historians, unaware of the full story, wrote about Auschwitz without knowing that a Polish cavalry officer had organized resistance inside the camp and documented genocide in real time. The institutional failure to act on Pilecki's intelligence during the war was compounded by institutional suppression of his story after the war. The man who volunteered for a suicide mission survived it and tried desperately to make the world understand what was happening, died not as a hero, but as a prisoner of another totalitarian regime that feared the truth he represented. The vindication came slowly, beginning in the 1980s as communist control weakened. Survivors of Auschwitz began speaking more openly about ZOW and Pilecki's role. Historians gained access to previously classified archives. Józef Garliński published Fighting Auschwitz, documenting the resistance movement inside the camp. As the Soviet Union collapsed and Poland regained independence, Pilecki's story could finally be told fully. In 1995, 47 years after his execution, Pilecki received an official pardon from the Polish government and a restoration of his military rank. In 2006, he was awarded the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest decoration. In 2013, he was promoted posthumously to colonel and honored as a righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. The modern recognition reveals how completely the initial institutional skepticism missed the truth. Pilecki wasn't exaggerating. His reports were accurate. The systematic murder of millions wasn't atrocity propaganda, but literal description of German policy. The skeptics who dismissed his intelligence as unbelievable were wrong, and their skepticism contributed to the death toll by delaying action that might have saved lives. The bureaucratic inertia that prevented bombing Auschwitz, that prioritized other objectives, that treated Holocaust intelligence as lower priority than conventional military operations. All of it represented institutional failure on a scale that matched the crime itself. Pilecki had done the impossible by surviving long enough to report what was happening. The Allies failed by refusing to do the possible, act on his intelligence. The legacy of Pilecki's mission cascades through multiple levels. In the immediate years after his escape, ZOW continued operating inside Auschwitz until the camp's liberation in January 1945. The organization provided mutual aid to thousands of prisoners, maintained morale, and preserved documentation that would later be used in war crimes trials. Some ZOW members survived and testified at Nuremberg, providing detailed evidence about camp operations. The intelligence Pilecki gathered formed the foundation for historical understanding of how Auschwitz evolved from a prison camp into an industrialized killing center. Without his reports, the timeline would be less clear, the bureaucratic mechanisms less documented, and the specific individuals responsible less identifiable. In the generation following the war, Pilecki's story became a case study in intelligence failure. Military analysts and historians examining why the Allies didn't bomb Auschwitz repeatedly cite Pilecki's reports as evidence that the information was available, was detailed, and was actionable. The failure wasn't insufficient intelligence, but insufficient will to act on intelligence that contradicted institutional assumptions and strategic priorities. The lesson resonates beyond World War II. Intelligence only matters if institutions are capable of believing and acting on information that challenges their worldview. In the longer term, Pilecki's example influenced how democratic societies think about moral obligations during humanitarian catastrophes. The systematic failure to act on Holocaust intelligence, despite detailed reports from sources like Pilecki, contributed to the development of international human rights law, the responsibility to protect doctrine, and institutions designed to prevent genocide. The principle that the international community has an obligation to intervene when governments engage in mass murder traces, partly to the recognition that the Allied failure to act on Holocaust intelligence was a moral catastrophe that must not be repeated. In the present day, Pilecki's story remains relevant to debates about intelligence, intervention, and moral courage. When chemical weapons are used in Syria, when genocide occurs in Rwanda or Darfur, when authoritarian regimes commit atrocities against minority populations, the question always emerges: do we have sufficient intelligence to act? Pilecki's mission demonstrates that intelligence is rarely the limiting factor. The limiting factors are institutional will, bureaucratic inertia, competing strategic priorities, and simple indifference to suffering that doesn't directly threaten national interests. Every modern failure to prevent atrocity echoes the Allied failure to act on Pilecki's reports. We know what's happening. We have the information. We lack the will to act on it. The quantified total impact of Pilecki's mission is staggering when fully enumerated. He spent 947 days inside Auschwitz, equivalent to 2 years, 7 months, and 1 week. He organized approximately 1,000 prisoners into ZOW. He sent multiple detailed intelligence reports documenting the evolution of the camp from 1940 to 1943, totaling tens of thousands of words. ZOW provided mutual aid to thousands of additional prisoners who weren't formal members, redistributing food and medicine that saved hundreds of lives. The intelligence he gathered became foundational documentation used in the Nuremberg trials and subsequent war crimes prosecutions. His testimony helped establish the timeline of genocide and the bureaucratic mechanisms that implemented it. The moral example of his voluntary infiltration, a soldier who walked into a death camp because someone needed to witness and report, stands as perhaps the most extraordinary act of individual courage in World War II. He proved that one person's refusal to accept that something is impossible can achieve what institutions consider unthinkable. The universal lessons from Pilecki's mission extend far beyond military history. First, courage isn't the absence of fear, but the commitment to act despite certain knowledge of the cost. Pilecki knew that entering Auschwitz likely meant death. He went anyway because gathering the intelligence mattered more than his survival. Second, institutional skepticism is often a shield against uncomfortable truth. The Allied commanders who dismissed Pilecki's reports as exaggerated weren't stupid. They were trapped by their inability to imagine that genocide on an industrial scale was possible. When reality exceeds imagination, institutions default to skepticism rather than action. Third, intelligence without action is worthless. Pilecki succeeded in every aspect of his mission except the most important one: convincing people to act on what he reported. The failure wasn't his, but the institutions that received his intelligence and filed it, rather than responding. Fourth, recognition often comes too late for the people who deserve it. Pilecki died as a condemned traitor. His vindication came 4 decades after his execution, long after he could benefit from it. Fifth, moral courage requires accepting that you may never see the results of your sacrifice. Pilecki had no guarantee that his intelligence would be believed or acted upon. He gathered it anyway because not trying was unacceptable. These lessons remain applicable across contexts. When whistleblowers expose institutional corruption, when journalists report from conflict zones, when activists document human rights abuses, they face the same dynamics Pilecki confronted: institutional skepticism, bureaucratic inertia, strategic indifference, and the possibility that their sacrifice will be ignored or dismissed. Modern equivalents exist everywhere. Intelligence analysts warning about genocide before it happens. Scientists documenting climate change when institutions refuse to act. Healthcare workers reporting disease outbreaks when governments deny the problem. Each represents someone gathering intelligence that people in power don't want to believe and won't act upon until catastrophe makes inaction impossible. September 19, 1940. A street corner in Warsaw's Żoliborz district. Rain-slicked cobblestones reflecting searchlights. A man deliberately walking toward arrest rather than away from it. The image returns, transformed by knowledge of what followed. The impossible mission succeeded. The cavalry officer with no intelligence training infiltrated Auschwitz, survived 947 days, organized 1,000 prisoners, sent comprehensive intelligence, and escaped. He documented genocide in real time with precision that historians still rely upon. He proved that courage and organization could exist even in conditions designed to destroy both. He did everything right. The tragedy is that it wasn't enough. The reports were filed, the intelligence was ignored, the bureaucracy shrugged. Hundreds of thousands more died in Auschwitz after Pilecki escaped. The gas chambers operated until November 1944, when the Germans dismantled them to hide evidence of their crimes. The crematoriums burned until the last days before Soviet liberation. The system Pilecki had documented in such detail continued operating because the Allied command decided that bombing it wasn't a military priority. Witold Pilecki was executed in Mokotów prison on May 25, 1948. His last words, according to witnesses, were, "I've been trying to live my life so that in the hour of my death I would feel joy rather than fear." His body was dumped in an unmarked mass grave that remains unlocated. No memorial marks the spot where he died. His children grew up not knowing the full truth about their father's service. For 41 years, the Polish state classified him as a criminal and forbade public acknowledgement of his sacrifice. Today, when we see intelligence reports about atrocities, when whistleblowers reveal corruption, when someone risks everything to document what powerful institutions want hidden, that courage traces directly to examples like Pilecki's. Every person who refuses to accept that evil must go unreported exists because people like Pilecki establish that reporting matters even when no one listens. The Witold Pilecki roundabout in Warsaw, the memorials in Oświęcim near Auschwitz, the historical markers and museum exhibits all represent belated recognition that arrives after this the person who deserved it is long dead. The final statistic matters most. Approximately 1.1 million people were murdered in Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945. One man volunteered to go inside, survive, and report what was happening. He succeeded in his impossible mission. The world failed in the much simpler mission of believing him and acting on his intelligence. That failure cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The lesson isn't that individual courage is useless. The lesson is that individual courage must be matched by institutional will to act on uncomfortable truth. Pilecki's example asks every person in positions of power a simple question. When someone risks everything to tell you something you don't want to hear, will you dismiss it because it's unbelievable, or will you act because it's true? Witold Pilecki walked into Auschwitz to force that question. 75 years later, we're still struggling to answer it.